President Trump said the war was already won, but is now demanding help from his allies. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively blocked, Washington warns NATO will face consequences if it fails to help secure the crucial waterway. So is that now the sole objective of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran? And will more nations be pulled into a war of choice? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. Since the goalposts have changed repeatedly, the ultimate goal of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran remains largely undefined. What is clear is the fear that what's happening in the region could spiral out of control. It's already having a profound effect on the global economy, and with concerns of a looming ground invasion, allies of the United States have been warned that they need to step up to protect the Strait of Hormuz. Here's a look.
When the US president launched Operation Epic Fury, Donald Trump said the mission was to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon. Then it shifted to eliminating Iran's leadership. Then it was to destroy its military. And now it is about protecting the Strait of Hormuz.
We are demanding that these countries come in and protect their own territory, because it is their territory. It's a place from which they get their energy.
20% of the world's oil and gas supply comes via the waterway. And Trump's now demanding that a coalition of countries escort ships through the strait. That includes China.
And China, as an example, gets about 90% of its oil from the Hormuz Strait. And nice to have other countries police that with us. And we'll help. We'll work militarily. As far as I'm concerned, we've essentially defeated Iran.
Trump has a visit with Chinese President Xi Jinping scheduled for later this month, but he says he might delay that. Nearly 24 hours earlier, he posted on social media that the countries affected by the Hormuz Strait closure, China, France, Japan, South Korea, the UK, and others, should deploy forces. Japan, France, and Australia have said no. South Korea says they will make a decision after a careful review. However, the UK government is considering a plan to send mine-sweeping drones to help clear the waterway.
We first have to discuss what the member states are willing to do in the Strait of Hormuz.
We're there for NATO. We're helping them with Ukraine. As many, it's got an ocean in between us. It doesn't affect us, but we've helped them. It'd be interesting to see what country wouldn't help us with a very small endeavor.
Trump's focus on the strait comes after the latest US strikes on Karg Island that he says has totally demolished most of Iran's main oil terminal. While on board Air Force One, Trump said he doesn't know if Washington wants a deal and that Iran wants to make a deal, quote, very badly. But Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi says Tehran has not asked the US for a ceasefire. World leaders are now facing a difficult choice as the war grinds on and focus turns to keeping the Strait of Hormuz operational. Christina Shimich, TRT World.
Well, joining me now to look further at where this conflict stands and where it's heading are from Tel Aviv, member of the Knesset representing the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality, Ofer Cassif. From Washington, D.C., former State Department official and senior advisor to democracy for the Arab world now, Charles Blaha. And joining us shortly from London, founder of the Global Political Research Center and political advisor, Alexander Claxon. Thank you all so much for being with me. Charles, I'll start with you in Washington and begin, if you can, by explaining the U.S. position here. As we know, it's been contradicted by people both within the administration and outside the administration. Is it now at least acknowledged that this is a war? Do they still believe the U.S. has won? Or is that posture unraveling entirely?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I'm glad you brought that point up. it's pretty clear that the U.S. is in the middle of a war. However, the administration is very reluctant to use that term. And the reason is because under the U.S. Constitution, only the Congress has the power to declare war. And so it's plain we're in the middle of a war, but I would expect the administration officials to continue to tiptoe around the term. President Trump has thrown it around carelessly, but the use of that word has constitutional implications. And it's really odd that now the U.S., in terms of our military involvement with Iraq, it's really combat, is trying to do the same thing with words that Vladimir Putin is doing with Ukraine. Remember, Vladimir Putin did not call the Ukraine invasion an invasion. It didn't call it a war. It's invented a new term, special military operation. And it's really ironic that now the U.S. finds itself in the same rhetorical problem as Vladimir Putin.
Right. Okay, I was going to turn to Alexander. It looks like he's still, unfortunately, getting hooked up. So, Charles, let me stick with you for a second. I mean, beyond the declaration of war, then, there's now seems to be some expectation that allies should step up to help in whatever operation this is. Does Washington really expect its allies to now get involved? Should that be a foregone conclusion, the way Trump has put forward?
Well, it seems that President Trump's call has been pretty ad hoc. I mean, let's remember that the fact that we're even talking about the Straits of Hormuz is not something that anybody was apparently talking about when this war started on February 28th. They were talking about regime change, which changed to eliminating missiles, which changed to total unconditional surrender. So what this Straits of Hormuz problem does is it illustrates how these types of situations, when you use military force, can really spin out of control. And it's very concerning that the U.S. Is now asking other countries to intervene in a war that the U.S. and Israel started. They didn't start that. That the U.S. and Israel started, and asking allies to expose their naval assets to combat. And the U.S. spent weeks assembling naval assets in the region. We now have 2 carrier battle groups there, over 30 vessels, and now we're asking allies to pony up in something they had no role in starting.
Right. Alexander Claxon joins us now from London. Glad you're online, Alex. Hopefully you heard that analysis. So let me ask you, I mean, is Washington demanding that allies step in now to secure the Strait of Hormuz, in a sense, a way to force NATO into this still U.S. undeclared war?
Yeah, well, it's a bizarre situation, really, because just a few weeks ago, about a week ago or so, President Donald Trump told the United Kingdom that your help is not required. Your help is too late. We are already winning this war, so no need to join it. And just 1 week later, now he's asking not just the UK, but the whole of NATO, and as well as China and other countries, to join the war. But of course, that's not what NATO is for. NATO is supposed to be a defensive alliance, not an alliance that joins aggressive attacks by other members, especially in situations where this is a war of choice. It's a war that could have been avoided. There was no imminent risk from Iran to the United States or Israel. So from that point of view, of course, I don't foresee that many NATO allies would want to join this confrontation, because most of the allies of the United States want a diplomatic resolution to this conflict, because that's the only way that the Strait of Hormuz can be reopened again, and that's the only way that the global economy can be prevented from having a complete meltdown.
Yeah. And Alexander, I mean, Trump has been able to try to pressure certain allies and non-allies into doing what he wants based on his tariff threat. That was actually ruled illegal by the Supreme Court, but that's been his major card to play. So now that he doesn't have that tool in the toolkit anymore, where do you see him going to try and bring other players and allies to bring them to the U.S. defense here, now that it's shown that it can't win quickly, at least, with military force alone?
Well, yeah, I mean, the United States under Donald Trump has been alienating allies around the world. Among the Gulf countries, for example, many of them will now be questioning whether it was beneficial to them to have US bases located in those countries. They were supposed to protect the Gulf countries from the situation that they're currently in, but it was in fact because the United States has its bases in those countries that now the Gulf countries are under attack. Likewise, among the European allies, it's a strange situation where just a few weeks ago, Donald Trump has been saying that the United States are just about to take over Greenland, and there's nothing that the allies can do about it, essentially.
Yeah,
amazing. You know, essentially, right. And now he's saying, look, can you please help me out? You know, I think that many allies are.
I don't think he said please. But,
right, well, that's right. He didn't say please. He's basically saying just do it. And of course, that's not a way to treat allies.
Yeah.
I think many of them are essentially considering that he's acting as a bully. He acted as a bully when it comes to Iran, which is supposed to be an enemy, but he's treating his allies as if they're the enemy as well.
Remarkable that we actually seem to have forgotten about Greenland, and that was top of the agenda for weeks at a time there, and it was imminent, you know, that the U.S. was going to take Greenland. That's become a minor detail, it feels now. But Ofer, let me turn to you. The fact that Iran has been able to close the Strait of Hormuz and disrupt global, you know, energy supplies to this point shows again that military superiority means nothing. And Iran can fight very hard with the simplest of conventional weapons and basic resolve to survive. So does that register with Israelis? Is it factoring in at all in their strategy, or does it make them dig their heels in even harder to support this war?
That is, first of all, thank you for having me. The problem is that, in my view, there's no strategy at all, neither on the part of Israel nor on the part of the United States. They waged this war, and I agree with the previous speakers that this war was a war of choice. It was not a preemptive war because there was an imminent threat by Iran. Everybody knows that the real reason for both the United States mainly and also the government of Israel, the real reason was a political and economic one. So unfortunately, there's no strategy at all. What's been happening now in the Straits of Hormuz won't change anything, I'm afraid, as far as the Israeli government is concerned. Because the Israeli government in general, and Netanyahu in particular, are solely interested in staying in power and in executing their insane, criminal, genocidal plan of the Greater Israel and of annexing the occupied Palestinian territories, invading to Lebanon, everything under the smokescreen of the war with Iran. That's the real issue here. And unfortunately, as I said, there's no strategy because strategy requires politics, diplomacy.
But,
we all remember, as von Clausewitz said very famously in the 19th century, that war is the continuation of diplomacy by other means. Here it seems that war is the only thing, no diplomacy whatsoever.
But Ofer, while you say there's no strategy, others argue that there is a strategy, and it is that greater Israel future that especially the more extremist leaders in power in Israel now foresee, which is why this issue of these religious grounds for this entire conflict are coming more and more to the forefront. There's more and more analysis and a deeper looking at what they believe. Do you not think that's at play?
I don't think it's a strategy. I think it's much more rhetoric than practice, because everybody knows, or at least I assume that most of the elements in the Israeli coalition and government know perfectly well that this dream, or rather nightmare of the Greater Israel, this messianic insanity, has no basis in reality. They know it. So it's not a real strategy, it's rather rhetoric. One has to understand that in the Israeli political system, the parliamentary coalition system, there's never been a situation in which one party constituted the government. The party, even the larger party, the largest party, is dependent upon its allies within the coalition. And Netanyahu knows that his way to stay in power, to keep the government and the coalition intact until the elections, is by promising such insane things like the Greater Israel, like the annexation of the occupied Palestinian territories, like an ethnic cleansing that goes on in the West Bank. Since the war with Iran began, it's on the rise. The ethnic cleansing, the murderous ethnic cleansing in the West Bank is on the rise. Those things are not a real strategy. Those are part of the rhetoric and, unfortunately, the practice in the short run that Netanyahu allows and conducts because he wants to keep the government intact. That's the only thing.
Okay.
So it's tactics rather than strategy.
Okay, well, let me come back to Charles then in Washington and ask a little more about the so-called strategy, at least from the U.S. perspective. We're hearing so much now about Karg Island and whether or not the U.S. will try to seize that key oil depot, especially via ground invasion. I mean, Senator Lindsey Graham has said, quote, "He who controls Karg Island controls the destiny of that war." Is that an overstatement, or is that how the administration sees it?
Well, Senator Graham isn't exactly a Middle East expert. I would note that the United States bombed Karg Island 2 or 3 days ago. And what we bombed, according to the U.S. Central Command, were just the military facilities there and not the oil facilities. That does show that the U.S. Is concerned about not inflicting permanent damage on Karg Island's oil capacity. But in order to, as you pointed out, there is increasing talk of a U.S. Ground deployment in Iran, and there's been speculation about Karg Island. That, in the U.S. domestic opinion, would really change the calculus even more, because that would be what we're calling in the U.S. boots on the ground. And there is a lot of sensitivity, even among Americans and congressional members of the president's own party. There's a lot of sensitivity to putting United States troops into Iranian territory. That also significantly increases the possibility of United States military casualties, which is another very, very sensitive point in the U.S. But again, what this shows is how the situation with the U.S. involvement in Iran has really drifted and really kind of spun out of control.
Well, let me ask Alexander about the same issue, if you can comment on Karg Island, what's at stake there as well, plus what you think are the potential unforeseens here, the things that you fear might be coming that no one has recognized yet, and in which case they may eventually say, especially out of Washington, this was a case of better the devil we know.
Yeah. When it comes to the Karg Islands, essentially the United States is trying to go up the escalation ladder. We have to remember that the United States believed that they would be able to win this war essentially in a few days. They thought that if they could decapitate the Iranian leadership, that the Iranian state essentially would either collapse or there would be a revolution or some kind of a failed state, and the United States will be able to declare victory in a few days. Obviously, that hasn't happened, so now they have to up the ante, and they're trying to do that by attacking this particular island. But I should say that even if they were to take over this island, that wouldn't really be a defeat for Iran, because essentially they would be like sitting ducks. The American military, its ships, its soldiers, if they were to essentially be stationed on this island, they could come under significant attack by the Iranian military through its missiles and so on. In terms of what we could expect, or something that we're not talking about, is potentially desalination plants. That's one way that Iran could go up the escalation ladder and try and essentially push back if the United States tries to attack its infrastructure, its oil facilities, and other important sectors. Most of the Gulf countries rely significantly on desalination plants. That's essentially where they get their fresh water from. And if Iran were to attack these plants around the Gulf, then that would be a major, major problem for the Gulf countries.
Yeah.
So that's one card that Iran can play if they feel that the United States is essentially crossing a red line by attacking Iranian oil facilities.
Let me come back to Ofer. You know, we spoke of the vision of greater Israel that a number of leaders have, and you made a lot of mention of the goal to fully occupy the West Bank. And we have to remember now we're 2 years plus into Israel's war on Gaza, and Hamas is still effectively in charge. And as you and I spoke of, you know, years ago, the massive destruction has really only helped to create greater resentment and more enemies with more determination than ever. So what do you see in the long term for what is being created now by this aggression in Gaza, in the West Bank, now on Iran, and in Lebanon?
Well, the writing was on the wall, unfortunately written in blood, because everybody knew, or everybody should have known. We said it from minute one, just after the terrible massacre of 7 October in the southern part of Israel. We said that the only way to prevent such an event from happening again, the only way to prevent bloodshed on all parts, Israeli, Palestinian, Iranian, Lebanese, etc., is by the politics of peace. Everybody knows across the world that the only way to achieve peace, stability, and security for everyone, including Israel, is by ending the occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories. Everybody knows that. The problem is that the current government in Israel, and unfortunately most of the governments throughout the years, especially in the last decade, since the assassination of Rabin at least, have been fanatics, and especially the current one. The current government of Israel consists, as you yourself said, to a great part of it is of fanatic, messianic elements who prefer land over lives of human beings. So I'm afraid that in the short run, for sure, everybody is going to pay a terrible price. We are already paying the price.
Yeah.
But I do believe that our struggle will go stronger. The struggle continues. We've been demonstrating with all the difficulties, the violence we encountered by fascist militias and the police. We still take to the streets within the limitations posed upon us to demonstrate against the war and to call for peace, ending the occupation and the genocide in Gaza that continues, and the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank that grows stronger and uglier. And I'm sure we will win in the end. The question is how much blood everybody is going to pay until then.
Yeah, the question is, where is the bottom? Very quickly, we have 1 more minute. Charles, before we go, I just needed to ask you about this because we know President Trump has delayed a meeting with the Chinese president off the back of this conflict. Should President Trump meet with Xi Jinping? How important is that to have, you know, those lines of communication kept open?
Well, it's always important for the United States to be in active diplomacy with China. That's always important. And the problem is that even before the last few days, there were reports that the agenda for President Trump's meeting with Xi Jinping, that the agenda wasn't determined. And what this suggests, again, is that with regard to this summit, this has been sort of like the war. It's been improvised. It's been ad hoc. And it would be difficult to understand what the agenda of the meeting would be. The U.S. President Trump has asked China to contribute ships to escort tankers through the Straits of Hormuz. China is very far away. China would be extremely reluctant to do anything like that. And what would be a better deal for China would be to talk to Iran and get an exception for Chinese tankers going to China.
Okay, Charles, that will have to be the final word for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us. Now, before we go, let's take a moment to get a clearer picture of what's actually happening on the ground in Iran. And joining me from the capital, research fellow at the University of Tehran, Mohammad Eslami. Mohammad, thank you so much for being with us. First of all, I know you heard a good part of the analysis, the exchange there between our three panelists. I'm just wondering what your take is on the current state of this conflict and where you think it's going from where you are on the ground in Tehran.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I think that from the Iranian perspective and from the Iranian point of view, President Trump is really in a very important problem. He has started this war on Iran without any specific strategy. First of all, he's talked about nuclear issues, then he talked about Kurds, then he talked about some regime change within the political system, and now he's talking about the Strait of Hormuz. Everybody knows that Donald Trump doesn't care about anything and doesn't care about the interests of any of the countries around this Persian Gulf. You know that Trump himself ruined the American security structure of the Persian Gulf. After all these countries around the Persian Gulf, they were thinking that the Americans would help them against any attack by any country. Especially they were thinking about possibilities from Iran.
Right.
But they now say that the first priority from the American point of view is Israel. The American administration doesn't care about what's going on in Bahrain, what's going on in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Qatar, anywhere else.
Mohammed, we just have a minute. I need to ask you this question because one of the reasons that some theorize the U.S. and Israel decided to strike now, though, is because Iran's so-called proxies have been so weakened. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, as well as Syria. Were they right about that? Or are those proxies, do you believe, still a force to be reckoned with?
I think that they may have these kind of things in their mind, but the reality shows that it was not true. Because right now the Houthis are threatening the Americans and as well, and also Saudis. And at the same time, the Hezbollah is right now attacking the Israelis. So if the so-called proxies, I don't know if they are proxies, Iranian proxies or not, but if these so-called proxies were beaten by the Americans, right now Trump was much more easier to think only about Iran. But right now he has lots of complicated problems. He cannot solve them. And I think that not only Trump, but also his Secretary of War, his also Rubio, all of them, they cannot understand what's going on in Persian Gulf. There are much really important, complicated questions regarding the Strait of Hormuz and Khark Island and such like this.
Mohammad Eslami, very unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers and thank our viewers for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media. Do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.